So, yeah, in the news, there's talk of petrol prices going up and daylight robbery. You might even think it's a highway robbery when you have to go and fill your car up with petrol these days. The notion of a proper highway robbery, though, a proper highwayman, is under discussion now on BBC Radio Nottingham, thanks to Dr. David Dunford, who is here. Hello.
Hello.
And I'm pleased to say you haven't come in wearing a black eye mask, sporting pistols, which is the image we have, I think, of highwaymen and Dick Turpin riding on his horse. Much of this, I suspect, is completely wrong, isn't it? Our popular view of what a highwayman is or was.
Well, I think I started off with that sort of idea as well, but probably more from the carry-on films than real life. My interest really just started earlier this year. I went to the Galleries of Justice exhibition and had a look at what they'd got, and they told some fascinating stories. And I thought, well, I'd like to know whether the same sort of thing happened in West Bridgford and how much I could find there.
So the highwaymen and women of West Bridgford, I mean, there do seem to be female names in what you've discovered.
Well, there's an old story about Joan Phillips, and it's a beautiful story. I mean, she was supposed to be a beautiful woman, and this was the end of the 17th century. And she came from daughter of a wealthy farmer down in Northamptonshire, and she had a love of Edward Bracy, who sort of lured her away from a comfortable life into a life of crime. And they did various robberies, but then they settled down for a time running a pub before they then took to the road robbing stagecoaches all around the country.
How much could they make from a successful robbery of a stagecoach in in the terms of the day and perhaps in modern day terms?
It's always very difficult to convert money from those days to these days, but certainly the equivalent nowadays of thousands of pounds from people,
right,
would be what you could get.
Right, and they would do this how? Would they just stand in front of?
I think Joan was actually the sort of style that you did describe, but I think perhaps she might just have been fiction, because although there's a lot written about her, when you look more carefully, and other people have, it all goes back to just one book published in 1719, which is actually full of lots of legends like this, but a lot of them turn out not to be true at all.
Oh.
And
a good story.
Her last robbery was supposed to be taken place on what's now the A60, the Loughborough Road in West Bridgford, just south of where it turns off to Melton Road. Caught there with Bracy, taken to the courts, tried, found guilty, sentenced to death, and they actually built a gallows on Wilford Lane, not far from that crossroads, and hung her there. That's how the story goes. But I was looking a while ago through the parish records, the registers for St Giles Church in West Bridgford, and somebody at the time, back in 40 years later, in 1726, had written that the gallows had been built in Wilford Lane on August the 9th, 1726, and a man hanged there the next day and buried under the gallows. And I thought for a moment, perhaps this is Joan Phillips and her friend. But the last line it put was, "No one ever knew gallows to stand in the lordship before." And, this was only 40 years after Joan was supposed to have been hung there on the gallows. And we know what old men in villages are like. They would have a memory for something like that, especially a beautiful woman in such a story, and they'd have told the story. So I think Joan Phillips, yes, she fits the image that we all have, but perhaps that's because the image was created by people who wrote legends in those days anyway.
So perhaps the most famous highwayman story is Dick Turpin, is it? And his ride, was he the one who was supposed to have ridden from one end of the country in a day?
I don't know the stories, but I suspect that as with many of these people, it was great to build an image and to have your own history, which would frighten people as well.
I mean, one of the things that I wonder is if you were driving a stagecoach, and you have to imagine that many of them would come through this part of the world, because we have the old North Road coming up through the east of Nottinghamshire, and the roads that's the A60 and the A614, all very ancient highways.
West Bridgford was only a very small village, maybe 30, 40 houses at most, and scattered all over the place. But it was the way south, and the way east and west.
Trent Bridge,
as well. Yes.
It was one of the few river crossings. So, here's a question for you. Why didn't the people who were driving the stagecoaches have guns? Then if somebody in front of them said, "Stand and deliver," and pointed a gun at them, they were probably higher up on the stagecoach. They said, "No, bang, off you go." The sort of the romance almost of this gun-toting highwayman seems to have overtaken the reality.
That sounds more like an American approach to things, and certainly I know of a story there where there was somebody on a stagecoach, and a woman on the stagecoach pulled out a small pistol from her handbag and was firing it through the doors, and she claimed she had her eyes closed, but one of her companions says that she had actually managed to wing one of the people chasing her.
Right,
but I don't know. You see, how much, if you're that poor that you want to go out and do these sorts of things, can you afford a gun? Can you afford a fast horse? I found in my research that back in 1771 on Wilford Hill, there was a highwayman on horseback, and he attacked two gentlemen in a post-chaise. But all they did was told the driver to drive on fast, and they outran the highwayman, got back into the centre of Nottingham quite safely. So I think with pistols of those days weren't that accurate, and you'd be probably better off just running fast if you had a better horse or two.
Has your research proven that West Bridgford has been a sort of crime-free zone for many years? Is that what you've done here? Well,
certainly I found a lot fewer highway robberies than I expected to find, which was a good thing. And of course, the idea of death as a penalty for anybody who committed one of these robberies was supposed to deter people, so it may well have been quite effective in doing so.
I'm not sure if before you got interested in the world of the highwayman, you'd watched films that featured them, whether serious or comic. Had you, like many of us, just fallen into believing this was the way of the highwayman world, and now you're thinking, actually, all these people have got it wrong?
Well, I'm sure there's truth in everything, but certainly the reality for most people day to day was very different from the way that we imagine it. And I suppose, really, how could you go about your daily life if you thought you were going to be robbed at any moment? And these are quite infrequent. The only time I really came across any cluster of robberies was round about the end of 1820, early 1821, when it was a big enough story that it seemed to be in the newspapers all around the country, saying a desperate gang of robbers have for some time past infested the town of Nottingham and neighbourhood and committed numerous depredations. I rather like reading the old newspapers. I think they had a different style of writing from what we have nowadays, and it paints a picture nicely.
These are the Alexander brothers, I take it, was it?
That's right.
Yeah, we shall talk some more about them and the world of the footpad. Who is a sort of non-horse-mounted highway robber, I think, in just a few minutes from now, if that's okay. David Dunford, who has been looking into robberies on the highway, particularly around the West Bridgford area. More from David. West Bridgford was a place where some bad things went on in the 16 and 1700s, but not as much as people perhaps thought about the highway robbers, and debunking the myth of Joan Phillips. Maybe she never really existed. And what about Dick Turpin? Could he have done what he actually said he did and gone from one end of the country to another? Perhaps what is clearer, though, is the world of the footpad, David. And did West Bridgford have footpads, and what were footpads?
Well, I suppose the first reaction from anybody in West Bridgford would be, well, we wouldn't have any footpads of our own, but they might have come down from Nottingham and prevailed upon our residents.
These are sort of with people without horse, I guess.
That's right. They're on foot. That's why they're called footpads. And yes, they do robberies on foot.
But they would attack people who were on horses.
Could do. January 1785, William Vinson, a farmer in Walton, was on his way home from market. He was on his horse, and when he got to West Bridgford, a couple of men jumped out on him, knocked him off his horse, stole money off him, got a guinea in gold, half a crown in silver. You don't get gold and silver now, do you? His silver watch and some things that he'd bought in the market. But then after that, rather strangely, they helped him back on his horse, shook hands, and wished him good night. And Vincent, though, he went home to Walton, got some help from the other villagers, and chased after these two. And of course, the disadvantage was that they were on foot and he'd got a horse, and he caught up with them by what's now the Trent Bridge Inn. The names were John Townsend and John Pendrell.
OK, and this is a matter of public record, is it?
Well, it's all in. I love reading old newspapers, as I said before, and yes, it's all in there. So it's a true story. Taken to court, found guilty, and sentenced to death. Which was the penalty then?
That's quite harsh. So it was, I suppose, a guinea in gold and 2 and 6 in silver plus sundry items. It was a fair old mugging, but to be sentenced to death.
I think that's a word that came to me as well. That nowadays we would call these things muggings, which sort of lessens them perhaps in people's minds, whereas then it was highway robbery.
And in those days, a public execution was a spectator event, wasn't it? Did people cheer, or were they happy to see these footpads sent on their way?
Well, I mean, certainly people were keen to encourage others not to commit these sorts of crimes, and the judge who sentenced these two actually said, "I will cause the laws to be executed with such severity as shall enable any gentleman to hang his watch by the highway side with full confidence of finding it there on his return another day." Although I'm not sure he could do that now, but that was his intention.
But there was some pity and understanding, I think, for people, wasn't there, that found themselves in the position of having to be footpads. Not everybody reviled them. The society understood that there was a class of people who resorted to this type of behaviour.
Yes, although I suppose there is something of the spectacle that people would go to nowadays. I suppose no different from stopping perhaps on a roadside when you see a crash that some people do as well. There's that sort of strangeness in us, isn't there, that wants to watch this. I mean, certainly when Pendrell and Townsend were executed, it was what was described as a prodigious throng of people that crowded every street came out to have a look at them. And when they were taken to the gallows, they found it quite difficult to get through the press of people.
And coming a little bit more up to date, and thus the detail becomes clearer, but a family who must have been notorious, the Alexander family, and the brothers who in the early 1820s were causing all sorts of mayhem. What were they up to? Well,
there have been a lot of robberies in the area, and there was a whole series of cases. We could start off in November 1820 when there was William Potter, a carrier from Loughborough. He was going back home from Nottingham. He got as far as Bunny and was stopped by 5 men. And he was robbed. He had 2 £10 notes on him, which must have been worth, as I say, probably 1,000 or so nowadays, and his watch. And the carter was near Bunny Hall, and he got some help from the servant there and the man's bulldog, which must have been useful, and caught one of them. And as a result, Samuel Alexander came to court. He was found guilty and he was sentenced to death. But at the same assizes in 1821, both his brothers Isaac and James were there as well, and they were being tried for robbing Thomas Blackshaw on the highway at West Bridgford of £2.5 and 6pence. Now, Isaac, who was the oldest brother, he was found guilty, but the youngest, James, wasn't, because there wasn't enough evidence for him. But that wasn't the end of James's day, really, because he was also wanted at Leicester Assizes for robbing the Kegworth carrier.
He didn't recognise county boundaries. He'd go and do his stuff wherever he could.
Where there's money, there's robbers, I think.
So these guys, what eventually happened to them? They were picked up eventually, and I think
all 3 brothers eventually were found guilty of robbery, usually of carters and carriers, and were sentenced to death. But at that time, you could be, instead of being hung, you could be sent to Australia. And the 2 older brothers were sent out to New South Wales, where James was sent out to Tasmania.
Wow. I mean, some might think that was too much of a punishment, really, going to Australia, but there we go. Fascinating to hear about some of the ne'er-do-wells around West Bridgford, told to you by David Dunford. Thanks for coming in to see us. Good to meet you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.